All right, I've got something today I think you guys are going to enjoy. So basically what I'm going to be talking about today is about character descriptions. Now, how and how much to describe characters is often a contentious topic among writers and among readers, right? Because some people might say, oh, well, I didn't really have a good feeling of what this character looked like. Or maybe you spent too much time talking about this character at a place where it messed up the pace of the story. There's all kinds of ways to do that. And so I thought it would be really fun to kind of dig down into one of the, in my opinion, one of the people who really got describing characters down to a science, and that's Rex Stout in his Nero Wolfe series especially. I mean, he's good at it in general, but he spent most of his life working on this Nero Wolfe series, so we'll cover some of that. And yesterday I spent a couple hours, not reading, but, skimming through 10 of the books, looking for some good examples. So we'll actually have some concrete examples and quotes here to look at, which I think will also be fun. So, what I took from Rex Stout's character descriptions, I want to kind of separate it into 4 different categories or points. And, hopefully what we'll do is we'll learn a little bit about, how to describe characters and kind of tricks for doing so in an effective way. So, basic idea number 1. For bit characters, for characters who aren't particularly important, and even for some important characters, the overall length of the character description is not much more than 1 sentence in general. We'll get some examples. For example, Fer-de-Lance. Page 153 of this particular edition, we have a description of Dr. Bradford. Quote, "One look at Dr. Bradford was enough to show me that I had been wasting a lot of pleasant suspicions which might have been avoided if I had happened to catch sight of him somewhere." That's not actually description, that's just Archie's introduction to the description. Here's the actual description. Quote, "He was tall and grave and correct, the distinguished old gentleman type, and he had whiskers." So, as you can see, there's a sentence there. And it gives you a couple of important little details about the character to kind of give you, and not just concrete details, but rather kind of an air of the character. What kind of style they have. And since it's a novel and there's a limited number of characters, as long as these styles are unique from character to character, you can kind of get a feel for each character on that basis. We can look at Some Buried Caesar, right? Over on page 75, quote, "The above-mentioned enemy that Wolfe was being gracious to was a short, fat person in a dirty, unpressed mohair suit with keen little black eyes and 2 chins, by name Charles E. Shanks." Again, 1 sentence, a couple of details, unpressed mohair suit, enough to give you kind of a generic feel for that character. We have from Over My Dead Body, page 9. We have the G-Man who appears, named Stahl. Quote, "He was all right, medium-sized, with good shoulders and good eyes, a little skimpy in the jaw, and he needed a shoe shine." Simple, gets the point, gives you a kind of a feel for the character. We have in Black Orchids, page 9. Quote, "In many ways, he was the exact opposite of Lewis Hewitt, for he looked up at Wolfe instead of down, and he wore an old brown suit that needed pressing, and his sharp gray eyes gave the impression that they wouldn't know how to beam." We see this often in Stout's description of characters. The look in their eyes, or the feel that you get from how they use their eyes. They might be sharp, or they might be dull, or they might be vacant, or they might be clever, or they might be darting around nervously, things like that. And then we have some descriptions of, we have his height. He's, shorter than Wolfe. We have, the way that he's dressed, things like that. All of these are good for creating kind of a not super detailed, but at least clear perspective of what the character looks like. And this is what Stout does for many of his minor characters. And there's a lot of value to that because it's both compact while still providing the reader with a little bit of a feel for what this character is and how he differentiates himself from other characters. So, all right. category number 2. And here we see something that Stout does specifically by having a character with a first-person voice. All of the Nero Wolfe books are written from a first-person perspective, specifically Archie Goodwin's perspective. And so we find Stout using this first-person perspective to produce a much stronger impact on descriptions than you might otherwise get if you were simply doing a very bland kind of narrator style thing. So let's take a look at this. We have Some Buried Caesar. We have pages 19 and 34. This is the description of Bert. Quote, "A specimen entered wearing dirty flannel pants and a shiny starched white coat with grease on the side of his face. He stood in the doorway and mumbled something about Mr. Pratt having arrived." And then further on page 34. Quote, "When Greasy Face appeared, I let him proceed with his function, which I must admit he performed promptly and well." So here we have an example where Archie's examination of someone, on his first glance at someone, gives him something that he uses as a nickname or a moniker for that character throughout the book. We'll also see that in Over My Dead Body on page 78, Archie refers to Rudolph Faber as the Chinless Wonder. And he uses this multiple times throughout the book to describe Rudolph Faber, who he does not like, for reasons that will be apparent if you read the book. Things like this, where Archie looks at someone and something catches his eye, and it becomes his description or nickname for that character throughout the book, gives you that same kind of connection too, because you recognize this person and this one clear, obvious, and significant trait that you can then think of them by or kind of visualize them with. We have another characteristic of Archie, for instance. Archie has a tendency to play with rich men and with butlers. So if we go to Some Buried Caesar and head to page 76, we see Archie playing with a politician. This one's a little bit of a long one, and it's long because Archie makes some fun with it. Quote, "I had been accosted by a tall, skinny guy in a pin-check suit, as young as me or younger, wearing a smile that I would recognize if I saw it in Siam. The smile of an elected person who expects to run again, or a novice in training to join the elected person class at the first opportunity. He looked around to make sure no spies were sneaking up on us at the moment, introduced himself as Mr. Hoozis, Assistant District Attorney of Crowfield County, and told me at the bottom of his voice, shifting from the smile to expression 9B, which is used when speaking of the death of a voter, that he would like to have my version of the unfortunate occurrence at the estate of Mr. Pratt. Archie then plays with him by telling him a joke and raising his voice too, which causes him to react like this. Quote, "That confused him because he had to show that he appreciated my wit without sacrificing expression 9B. Also, I attracted the attention of passers-by, and a few of them stopped in the aisle to look at us." So here we have Archie playing with a politician. We find Archie often playing with butlers in what was it? Fer-de-Lance. We have a point where where a butler says something to Archie, and Archie responds with, "You didn't think that up all by yourself, did you?" We have, there's the book Champagne for One, where Archie toys with the butler Hackett throughout the story. That one's quite funny and worth reading. What other things? We have further examples of Archie playing with the rich or people that he likes to kind of get their goat. For instance, quote, from Black Orchids, quote, "Lou himself, in his $200 topcoat and Homburg and gloves made of the belly skin of a baby gazelle fed on milk and honey, and a walking stick that makes your best Malacca look like a piece of an old fishing pole." Here he's describing Lewis Hewitt to Wolfe himself. We have The Silent Speaker, page 21. Quote, "If it had not been beneath the dignity of a member of the NIA Executive Committee, Winterhoff could have snagged a fee posing as a man of distinction for a whiskey ad. He even had the little gray mustache." Archie likes to poke fun at the rich, at butlers, at politicians, etc. It becomes part of his character, and then through that character you get special descriptions or unique descriptions of particular characters. We have cases where Archie makes personal remarks about someone. So ABAV would be and be a villain. Page 30. Quote, on the stoop was a surprise party. In front was a man about town in a topcoat the Duke of Windsor would have worn any day. Again, kind of taking a little bit of the wind out of the sails of rich people, especially well-dressed people. To his left and rear was a red-faced, plump gentleman, etc., etc., etc. But here's the thing. That red-faced, plump gentleman, Archie has further interactions with later in the story. And so all the way up on page 185, they have another encounter, and Archie says, quote, usually I am tolerant of the red-faced plump type, but every time that geezer opened his mouth, I wanted to shut it, and not by talking. So here we have a case where Archie makes a personal remark about someone, and then uses that personal remark later on in a later reference to kind of either comically or, describe his particular emotional response to someone, something like that. We have cases where Archie finds something either unexpected or unique in some way. For instance, in Not Quite Dead Enough, page 13, he's actually looking at Wolf, and he's returned from working at the army to try to get Wolf to work for the army. Quote, I'll never forget that sight as long as I live. I was speechless. He didn't exactly look smaller. He merely looked deflated. The pants were his own, an old pair of blue serge. The shoes were strangers, rough army style. The sweater was mine, a heavy maroon number that I had bought once for a camping trip, and in spite of his reduction of circumference, it was stretched so tight that his yellow shirt showed through the holes. There we have a lot of detail because here Archie is describing something unique, something unexpected. Wolf is basically, instead of using his brain to solve mysteries that the army wants him to solve, he's running around outside trying to get himself beefed up for actual combat. And Archie finds this quite amusing. In ABAV would be and be a villain. Page 12 of this edition. He's meeting Deborah Koppel, I believe. And he says, quote, she had already given me 2 surprises. At first glance, I had thought her eyes were small and insignificant. But when she faced me and talked, I saw they were quite large, very dark, and certainly shrewd. Also, because she was short and fat, I had expected the hand I took to be pudgy and moist, but it was firm and strong, though small. Her complexion was dark and her dress was black. Everything about her was either black or dark, except the gray, almost white by comparison, showing in her night-black hair. Here, we see that when Archie's having a personal reaction, when Archie's having an unexpected reaction to someone, that the descriptions get a little bit longer and they get a little bit more detailed. But there's always some kind of method to the madness of the length of the excess length of the description. Here he's talking about how he's being surprised multiple ways by Deborah Koppel as she greets him. Let's see, in PB would be Prisoner's Base, page 100, we have one of the most famous Wolf descriptions. Dewdrop Irby. This is 2 cases where Archie is surprised by something and where it results in Archie coming up with a nickname for him, because the lawyer's name is Albert M. Irby, I-R-B-Y, and here's how Archie describes him. Quote, it was a pleasure to go for that lawyer and usher him into the red leather chair, but I must admit that physically he was nothing to flaunt. I have never seen a balder man, and his hairless, freckled dome had a peculiar attraction. It was covered with tiny drops of sweat, and nothing ever happened to them. He didn't touch them with a handkerchief. They didn't get larger or merge and trickle, and they didn't dwindle. They just stood pat. There was nothing repulsive about them, but after 10 minutes or so, the suspense was quite a strain. Later on, Archie calls him Dewdrop Irby because of the drops of sweat on his head. You get little things like this. when the descriptions get long, it's because something is interesting to Archie. Archie is finding something interesting or surprising. And this is the kind of thing that a real person would do. They would take notice of something unique or unexpected or surprising about someone's appearance or the way that they carry themselves. And so we see the descriptions get a little bit longer, but then they always have a purpose to it. It's never just like, or it's rarely just like a very detailed description of clothes, except with women. Sometimes Archie describes women's clothing in quite a bit of detail, whereas with men, he's usually a little bit more circumspect. But that's part of his character as well, and part of why we like his voice so much. We have the silent speaker as well, page 21. For Breslow. Breslow looked as if he had been born flushed with anger and would die when the time came in character. And then later on, Breslow's angry expression becomes the further topic of Archie's descriptions, things like that. Then we have cases where the reason for the description to be a little bit longer is for Archie to banter with Wolf, for instance. So if we go to Black Orchids, page 4, Archie's talking about the Rucker and Dill exhibit with a woodland glade and a little brook with a pool and rocks that's inhabited. There's a man and a girl having a picnic. And then at 4 o'clock, the man lies down and takes a nap. And, quote, the girl takes off her shoes and stockings and dabbles her feet in the pool. That's when they crowd the ropes. Her face and figure are plenty good enough, but her legs are absolutely artistic. Naturally, she has to be careful not to get her skirt wet. And the stream comes tumbling from the rocks into the pool. Speaking as a painter, Wolf snorted. Pah! You couldn't paint a... I didn't say painting as a painter. I said speaking as a painter. I know what I like. The arrangement of lines into harmonious composition. It gets me. I like to study. She is too long from the knees down, replied Wolf. Or cut in Wolf. And this is a case where the description is a little bit longer, but the reason it's longer is so that Archie and Wolf can kind of banter about it, because Archie doesn't expect him to know what she looks like, and yet Wolf, as usual, surprises Archie by being observant and having seen her picture in the paper. So, this is one of the advantages of a first-person perspective. And so the question might be, well, wait a minute, how do we do this if we're writing in a more typical third-person perspective for a fiction story? And the answer is this. What you do is you jump into the shoes of a character just for a moment. And you, because as a third-person narrator, you can talk about your character's state of mind. And so what you can do, for instance, and this is just one example of many different ways you could handle this, but basically you could have one of your characters, upon meeting the new character, have a reaction, and you could talk about that reaction. So for instance, a character might look weak, and so a character, kind of comments to himself, well, he looks kind of, more spindly than I expected. Then you go into the handshake, and he's surprised at how firm his handshake is, or something like that. There's all kinds of little ways you can do this, even in third-person storybooks, simply by jumping into a character for a couple of seconds, for a sentence or two. And of course, what you're doing here is actually a double win for you as a writer, because number one, you're describing a new character, giving the reader a better way to understand what that character looks like, how they carry themselves, what they're dressed as, etc., etc. And number two, you're also giving one of your known characters a little bit of flavor, basically. You're saying, this is how this character perceives this other character. This is the first impression that he or she gets on this new character. And that can be very good for character building as well. So as you can see, it's very easy to do it with the first-person voice, but even in the third-person voice, you can kind of hop in and give some extra insight to your reader. And generally speaking, as long as it's not like in the middle of a heavy action scene, generally speaking, readers will appreciate that. Number 3, the treatment of recurring characters in Stout books. Now here's the thing about how Stout dealt with characters that occurred in multiple books. We have Fritz, we have Fred Durkin, we have Saul Panzer. We have a bunch of characters, right? And the way that Stout handled this was something that I really enjoy. And it's something that you can only really do if you're planning on writing a series already. But basically, the descriptions for these characters are almost always extremely short. One sentence, maybe even less, just part of a sentence. Because what's happening is Stout is planning on giving you a different sentence each story to describe the character. So, for instance, let's just look at Fred Durkin himself. We have descriptions of Fred in Fer-de-Lance, in TGS would be The Golden Spiders, and TSC would be The Second Confession. Let's take a look. Fer-de-Lance, page 3. Early on, super early on. Quote, Durkin was all right up to the neck. When I consider how thick he was in most respects, I am surprised how he could tail. I know bull terriers are dumb, but good tailing means a lot more than just hanging on. And Fred Durkin was good. There's a little bit more of that, but that's the description per se, right? And of course, Fer-de-Lance is the first book, so everybody gets a little extra description there. We have The Golden Spiders, page 72. Quote, in bulk, Fred Durkin would have made nearly 2 sols, but not in ability. He could tail all right, and you could count on him for any ordinary chore, but if you ran into something fancy, he was apt to get twisted. You could trust him to hell and back. So here we're building on Archie's evaluation of Fred as a detective. He's saying, number one, he's bulky, he's strong, he's dependable, he's a very good tailor, even though he's not particularly super intelligent. He can get tangled on tough jobs, but you could trust him to hell and back. That's a great little addition to our lore for Fred Durkin, and we're going to see even a little bit more. Over in The Second Confession, page 166, quote, it was nothing fancy. A bourbon and soda for Saul, and gin fizzes for Ori and me, and beer for Fred Durkin and Wolf. Straight rye with no chaser was Fred's drink, but I had never been able to talk him out of the notion that he would offend Wolf if he didn't take beer when invited. So, while the rest of us sat and enjoyed what we liked, Fred sipped away at what I had heard him call slop. So here we get Fred respects Wolf almost to a like an extreme degree, where he's like, well, I don't want Wolf to think I don't like the same beer that he likes. You know, I don't want to. Wolf typically invites people for beer, and sometimes he'll say, you know, to your taste, right? But sometimes Wolf just says, would anyone like a beer? Durkin doesn't want to say, no, I want this other thing. Durkin just says yes. He's, you know, he wants to please Wolf. He wants to kind of even imitate Wolf to a certain degree, and yet at the same time he can't quite bring himself to like the same beer that Wolf likes. We have descriptions of Fritz from Fer-de-Lance, page 60. Quote, Fritz smiled. He had a sweet sort of faraway smile. He could catch a joke, but never tried to return it. Good morning. There's a gentleman downstairs to see Mr. Wolf. We have our first description of Fritz, or our first, you know, like more interesting description of Fritz. I think that he's not really described early in the book, even though he does appear. We have other things, but in more books we get more details about Fritz. We know that he's gone hunting in Africa. We know that he's Swiss, and he has a Swiss newspaper delivered to the brownstone every day. We know that he collects cooking implements and cookbooks. He thinks that he has some of the cooking items that were used to cook for Julius Caesar. We know that we learn that he's interested in whether or not there's a case and possibly money coming in, but not the details. We learn that he believes that murder under any circumstances is not justifiable, basically, or you know, homicide, right? We have, and I didn't look up examples of this, but we also have the same kind of thing happen with Saul Panzer. Not only does Saul Panzer get frequently described as the best detective this side of the whatever, right? Saul Panzer is a fantastic detective, and the other, but we get other things too. Like Archie describes him having a big nose, wearing a cap, not a hat. We get a great little description in one of the shorts where Wolf has to go to Saul's house to hide out, and we have Saul, you know, kind of rolling out the red carpet, and we get some great descriptions of the things that Saul came up with to interest and impress Wolf, you know, for the first and possibly only time Wolf visited Saul's home. We find out that Saul owns a few houses in New York and gets some income through real estate that way. We learn that he could go and work for any particular agency, but he is so good that he, gets the pick of the litter of cases. He gets paid highly enough that he can just afford to take what he wants and forget about jobs and work as much as he wants, but not more than he wants to, right? And so for recurring characters, the thing we learn from Stout is this. If you're going to have a character that's going to appear in multiple stories, and people are writing series these days, that's just kind of how things go. A good thing to do for descriptions is to give them in bit by bit. And you can even do this in a single book, right? If we extend things, or not extend, but like compactify things a little bit, if a character appears at several different places throughout the story, you can describe him in several different ways each time. And if you just keep it down to a sentence or keep it down to a few words, then it doesn't ever really blockade the reader. It doesn't ever feel like you're piling on. But at the same time, over the course of the story, you learn a little bit more about this character, how they act, how they interact, how they dress, how they look, bit by bit, throughout a story or multiple stories. And that's, I think, also a really worthy technique to think about. Finally, number 4. Stout and Archie and Stout don't give long descriptions in general. Commonly what we get is usually like 1 or 2 details, something of the face shape, something of the face type, something of how they're dressed, something of their attitude. We note that Stout doesn't shy away from describing someone by their ethnicity, and neither does Archie. We note that in each book, every description of every character is different somehow. There's a lot of little descriptions where all you get is, oh, they're wearing a shirt like this and pants like this, or their eyes look like this, or they had a very long nose, or they were very lanky, or sometimes it's just a description of their voice. They have a good bass voice, or a nice tenor, or a baritone, or a reedy tenor, or something like that. But in general, these descriptions are different for each character in each book. And so Archie picks something different, something to differentiate each character, even bit characters, in each book, so that you have a unique cast of characters, basically. That if one person is described by having a long nose, nobody else is described by their nose, but maybe someone is described by his baldness. You have someone a woman who's described by the kind of hat that she wears. A woman described by, Archie often kind of goes into like whether women are curvaceous or not, things like that. And it's not true that you always have to go with how curvaceous a woman is, but you could create a character who refrains from describing women that way, for instance, and then have much more kind of non-visual descriptions, because this is how this person, your character, decides to treat women, for instance. There's 50 of these books or something like that, and there's multiple characters in each one. Were there any other ones that I thought were really interesting to mention real quick? Let's see. I found it. So, like I said, Archie doesn't stray away from describing someone by their ethnicity, but at the same time, when someone's ethnicity doesn't match, and you might say, well, I don't want to deal with stereotypes kind of thing, but sometimes Archie picks up that someone breaks a lot of stereotypes, and that's also can be an interesting description. And I think the best example of that comes from And Be a Villain. It's a description of Professor F.O. Savarese. Here's how it goes. Quote, "You have heard of the exception that proves the rule. Professor F.O. Savarese was it. The accepted rule is that an Italian is dark and, if not actually a runt, at least not tall, that a professor is dry and pedantic with eye trouble, and that a mathematician really lives in the stratosphere and is just here visiting relatives. Well, Savarese was an Italian-American professor of mathematics, but he was big and blond and buoyant, 2 inches taller than me, and he came breezing in like a March morning wind." So, people often are afraid of using stereotypes in their descriptions, but this is something that Stout actually played around with a lot in creating characters that maybe fit in with this stereotype here or this stereotype here, but oftentimes the most interesting descriptions come from where a character is drawn out as contrast to the expectations that one might have if one went by stereotypes. And so you can play with it that way too. So that covers, I think, the 4 elements that I wanted to talk about today. Number 1, overall length, about 1 sentence for bit characters. Number 2, the value of a first-person voice, or if you're writing in the third person, a temporary kind of jump into a particular character's state of mind. You can turn an association into a nickname. You can have a character kind of play around with other characters when they meet. You can have personal remarks lead to nicknames or even just judgments in general and the way that a character reacts to another. You can develop your own characters by explaining how they react to certain other characters when they meet. You can have characters find something unexpected or unique and use that as part of their description. And you can also have descriptions lead into banter, as we saw Archie and Wolf banter about the girl with her legs and her being too long from the knees down, according to Wolf. Number 3, treatment of recurring characters. If you have a character that's going to appear multiple times in a book or over the course of multiple books, you can give a little bit of description. You can even pare down the description a little bit each time, but what you do is you make those descriptions unique throughout the character's multiple appearances. And so at one description, you maybe describe the way they're dressed. The second description, you describe some characteristic of how they work or how they operate. Further on, you might talk about their eyes or a particular detail of their face that's memorable. And finally, number 4, use details. Use specific details, but different details for each character in a particular story. If you talk about someone's face shape, talk about someone else's nose or chin or something like that. If you talk about someone else's voice, talk about someone else's attitudes, talk about someone else's manner of dress. If you change it so that not only are you getting different descriptions for each character, but also you're describing a different thing, the reader will often find that to be interesting, and it'll give them not just one category, round face versus square face, right, between two characters, but different categories of kind of perception of these characters. This guy has a long nose. This guy has a square chin. This guy has a low voice. This woman is wearing a long dress. Things like that, and that way, it's not just this guy has a long nose, this guy has a short nose, this guy has a medium-length nose, right? Now, when the reader thinks of a character, they think of a different characteristic entirely, and that helps separate them even further in the mind of the reader. And you always want your characters to be separated in the mind of the reader so that they don't kind of muddle together and become this kind of undifferentiated blob. The more you can make your characters separate in the mind of the reader, and as a reader, I enjoy this too, where when I finish reading a book, I know each character and what they did, and there's no point where I'm like, well, wait, was it this guy that did this, or was it this guy that did this? And having that kind of clear, unique perception of each character helps me keep things separate and keep things, separate in my mind. And then, the last part of number 4 is basically, don't be afraid to use ethnicity, to use stereotypes, or to counter-use stereotypes as well. So that's kind of my thoughts. Rex Stout's stuff is eminently rereadable over and over and over again. You can, I don't know, well, for me it is. I can just pick up one of his books, and then pick up the next one, and then read the next one, and then read the next one, and then loop back. Some of the stuff is amazing. Some of it is functional, but still good. None of it is bad. And so I thought it would be fun to try to learn something about character descriptions, both for writers and for readers, from what Stout does. And so, yeah, that's my thing for today. I think that'll probably do it for this week. I'm currently reading a book called Doomsday Recon, which I'll try to have a review out for next week, and come up with some other interesting reading or writing topics for next week as well. So, as always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed me nerding out in some Nero Wolfe books. I spent about 2 hours yesterday flipping through these, not reading them, but like skimming through them and getting quotes and stuff like that. And so I hope that was fun too. Stout's voice in his books is always very fun to read and to listen to. And so I feel like, not imitate. I feel like it's good to not to imitate necessarily, but I feel like we can learn something from that. So with that, I'll say thanks again, and have a good week and have a good weekend, and I'll see you later.